They left her there when the tide was low, wrists scraped from the rowboat's edge, mouth dry from crying out to a husband who never turned back. Moira clutched her shawl as the chill bit through her damp dress, each gust of sea wind like an insult. The rock was slick and jagged, barely wide enough for her to sit, and as the waves lapped closer with each passing hour, the truth crashed over her harder than the rising sea. He had meant for her to die here. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was because she hadn't given him a child, or because the silver bracelet she'd worn was once her mother's and not his to command. But what Moira did know was this: no one was coming to save her. Her village would never question a man's tale. They'd believe she ran off into madness, consumed by grief or swallowed by guilt. The first time her foot slipped into the icy tide, she bit down a scream. By the second time, the water was at her knees, and her numb fingers clutched the barnacled edges. She prayed, not to the God her mother had whispered of, but to the old spirits of the sea her Gran had warned her about. If ever you find yourself abandoned, Gran had said, eyes sharp beneath her white cap, call to the sea, the old ones still listen to women wronged. So Moira did. With lungs full of salt and voice cracking, she cried, I was loved once. I was whole. Don't let me die here, forgotten. And then she heard it, soft at first, like a distant song, a melody that didn't belong to the wind or the gulls. Her eyes darted over the waves until she saw it, a shimmer, a shadow, something slipping just beneath the surface. The water stilled for a breath, and then broke. A pale face rose from the sea, hair like seaweed and eyes like polished stones. Not human, not monster, something older. Moira's tears stilled. The creature raised a webbed hand toward her. Come, the voice said, echoing both in her ears and in her bones. Moira didn't know what waited below, but she knew what waited if she stayed. She reached. Moira had never swum willingly in her life, but the moment her fingers touched the creature's hand, the cold no longer pierced. It was not warmth she felt, it was absence of fear. The tide that once threatened to swallow her now seemed to carry her, lifting her from the jagged rock like a cradle. The woman, if woman she was, guided her downward with a grace Moira could only describe as impossible. Beneath the surface, the sea was not black, as she had feared, but lit from within, threads of light curling like mist through the depths. Moira's lungs did not scream for air. Her limbs did not flail. There was only the sound of silence wrapping her and the pressure of a hand that held fast. Deeper they went, past ruins swallowed by time, arches of ancient stone, statues of forgotten gods, the remains of boats and bones alike. And yet, nothing felt grim. It was beautiful, in the way grief sometimes is after it has been understood. The creature paused in front of a great gate of coral, shaped like two hands reaching upward. With a single glance back, she pressed her palm to the center. It opened, not with sound, but with a ripple in the water like breath exhaled. Inside was a world Moira could not have imagined. Caves carved into the sea's floor, lit by bioluminescent moss, furniture woven from kelp and shell. Others like the woman, seal-skinned, sea-eyed but different in voice and gesture, gathered in silence watching her. One, older than the rest, stepped forward. You were not meant to die, she said, but death is what they offered you. Moira, overwhelmed, could only nod. Her hair floated around her face like strands of memory, her heart still clinging to the betrayal above. Why did you save me? She asked. The woman who had first reached her stepped beside the elder. Because once, I too was left on the rocks, and someone reached for me. Moira's chest ached, not with drowning, but with recognition. These were not monsters, they were survivors, castaways, wives, daughters, sisters. And somehow, she had been chosen. What happens now? she whispered. The elder gestured toward a chamber beyond, where sea glass caught the light like 1,000 tiny stars. Now, she said, you remember who you were before they tried to erase you. Moira followed. Moira had imagined the sea as a grave, not a haven. But in the days that followed, if time even moved the same down here, she found herself surrounded by the lost and the found. The women of the deep called themselves the salt sisterhood, not because they were born of one mother, but because the sea had taken them all in when the world above cast them out. Some had once walked moors in Ireland. Some had danced by standing stones in the highlands. Others had sung to babies they were never allowed to keep. Each one bore a scar, some visible, some etched beneath their skin, but none of them wept anymore. Their strength was silent and vast, like the sea itself. Moira was taught to move through the water without resistance, to speak through breathless glances and small, knowing gestures. They fed her on sea fruits and warm broth made from roots she'd never seen before, healing her from the inside out. At night, they wrapped her in weavings of kelp that shimmered like emerald silk, and she lay listening to their ancient songs, hummed lullabies that once lulled ships to ruin, but now soothed broken women to rest. The one who had saved her was called Naira. She spoke little, but watched much. Her gaze followed Moira as she trained, healed, remembered. "Why do you stay below?" Moira asked her once, as they sat on a ledge overlooking the light-touched current. Naira hesitated. "Because above I was hunted, below I am free." Her voice carried a sadness older than the tides. "But don't you miss the sun?" Moira asked. Naira turned her eyes upward to the soft glow of the sea's surface. "The sun burns those it does not understand." Moira thought of her husband's eyes when he dragged her to the boat, of the villagers who looked through her like glass. She nodded. "Then let them miss me instead." That night, the sisterhood gathered in a circle of stones. They passed her a carved pendant made of driftwood and pearl, etched with the symbol of the sea's embrace. Naira tied it around Moira's neck herself. "You are one of us now," she said. Moira touched the pendant, its weight both grounding and freeing. For the first time since she had fallen in love, she felt whole. For the first time since she had been betrayed, she felt chosen. Moira had almost forgotten the burn of sunlight, the sting of betrayal, the taste of fear. But the sea has a way of returning what you bury. One morning, as she swam beyond the coral gate with Naira to gather flowering seaweed, she saw it. A wooden oar drifting down from above, stained with moss and salt. Naira tensed. "A boat," she said, and her voice did not hide its dread. Moira's chest tightened. Could it be them? "Perhaps," Naira said, eyes darkening like a storm forming. "Or others like them." The Salt Sisterhood lived in secrecy. Their sanctuary was protected by tides and illusion, hidden from men who sought to conquer what they feared. But now, something had breached that silence. The women gathered in the circle chamber that night. The elder Sea Mother, known only as Morwen, traced runes in wet stone with her finger. If they search these waters, we must decide. Do we remain hidden, or do we rise? Some whispered of retreat, of deeper caves where no sunlight ever reached. Others spoke of facing the surface, of showing the world that the sea remembers what the land forgets. Moira's voice rose clear and steady. "Let me go to the surface. Let me see who they are." Gasps followed. It was forbidden, returning after one had been claimed. But Morwen raised her hand. "She was not born of us. She may walk unseen if she chooses." Naira grabbed her wrist outside the chamber. "You do not owe them your breath, Moira." Moira held her gaze. "But I owe myself the truth." That night, The sisterhood braided her hair with coral and kissed her cheeks with salt. As dawn approached, Nyera swam with her to the edge of the shallows. "Remember," she whispered, "the sea will always take you back. But not all who wait above are ready to lose you again." Moira surfaced slowly, lungs tight with memory. She crawled onto the same rock where she had once been left to die, but this time she did not shiver. She stood, and on the horizon a boat approached. In it were two figures, one she recognized and one she did not. Her past was sailing back toward her, and she was no longer the woman they abandoned. The oars creaked as the boat drew near, and Moira stood tall atop the sea-washed rock, her eyes sharp with a calm they would not recognize. The first man to rise from the bench was Callum, her husband. His hair was longer, his coat faded, but the sneer that tugged at his mouth had not aged a day. "So the stories were true," he muttered. "You're alive?" Moira didn't answer. The other man beside him, younger and quiet, held a brass compass in his hand and glanced between them with unease. "We followed the tides," he said softly. "They led us here." "She bewitched them," Callum snapped. "The sea women always do." He looked at Moira as if she were a stain on his boot. "I told them you drowned. They cried for you, prayed even. But I knew you'd make a fool of me one more time." Moira's jaw tensed, but she didn't flinch. "You lied because it was easier than admitting you were cruel." "You ran off with witches," he barked. "You were my wife." "No," she said, voice low as the waves. "I was your possession." The young man stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension. "I didn't come to accuse you," he said to Moira. "I came because the compass pulled me here." He held it out, and she saw now that its needle spun not northward, but toward her. "My mother had one like it," he added. "She disappeared near these shores 20 years ago. I thought, maybe." Moira's heart beat faster. The Salt Sisterhood. One of them could be his mother. She said nothing, but reached for the compass. The moment her fingers brushed it, the needle stopped spinning. It pointed behind her, toward the sea. "You need to leave," she said to Callum. "This place will not be yours again." "I came to drag you back," he growled, "alive or not." But as he stepped forward, the waters surged, not from tide, but from something rising, a shimmer, a shadow, Nyera. Her eyes burned like sunlight through water. Callum stumbled back. What is that?" "Justice," Moira said. She turned to the younger man. "If you want answers, follow, but only if your heart is clean." The rock beneath her glowed faintly. She stepped into the sea, fearless. The tide embraced her like an old friend, and the surface swallowed her whole. The water closed over Moira's head like a curtain drawn shut, yet her eyes opened with clarity. The young man, who had hesitated only a heartbeat, dove in after her, the compass gripped tightly in his fist. Callum remained on the boat, shouting curses that faded the deeper they sank. The current did not pull them. It welcomed them. Nyera swam beside Moira, casting an unreadable glance toward the man who followed. "He bears no shadow," she whispered. "Let him come." They led him through coral arches, past the pearl-studded walls of the sea cave, until he stood dripping and awestruck in the glowing chamber where the Salt Sisterhood waited. Murmurs rippled through the circle. One woman gasped. Another stepped forward slowly, a tremor in her lips. "Alric," she said, barely above a whisper. The young man blinked, tears immediately springing to his eyes. "Mother." The pendant at her throat shone like starlight, and when she embraced him, the water hummed with ancient joy. It was then Moira truly understood. What had been taken from these women was not just freedom, but family. The sisterhood had hidden for generations, carrying the grief of sons stolen, daughters slain, and voices silenced. But now, through chance or fate, A thread had been rewoven. "How did you find this place?" the elder Morwen asked. Alric turned to Moira. "It wasn't me. The compass, it belonged to her." He reached into his coat and pulled out another item, an old, water-stained letter. "I found this tucked inside the case. It's addressed to Moira." Moira took the parchment with shaking hands. The writing was her grand's. "If you're reading this, child, you survived. You always were meant to. The sea holds what men cast away, but it does not forget. Nor should you." Her breath caught. It was not just survival she had been given, it was legacy. Morwen stepped forward. "The time has come," she said, her voice firm. "We've hidden long enough. If one man with a good heart can find us, so can others, and perhaps not all will bring harm." Moira looked at Alric, who stood holding his mother's hand, eyes wide with wonder. "Then we let the tides decide," she said, "but no more silence, no more shadows." The sisterhood nodded. The current shifted as if the sea itself approved. A new tide had begun. News travels differently beneath the waves. By dawn, the waters near the coast churned with whispers of a man who had followed the sea's call and found what should have stayed hidden, of a woman once betrayed who now stood beside legends. The salt sisterhood, once content to remain folklore, began to stir like a rising tide. Moira stood before Morwen, her jaw set. "He won't stop," she said, speaking of Callum. "He'll tell others, men who won't hesitate to burn what they can't control." Morwen closed her eyes. Then the veil must fall. For centuries their realm had been masked by the sea's enchantments, hidden in currents that turned boats away, in fogs that made sailors forget. But enchantments fade when belief is broken, and the surface world no longer feared magic, only what it couldn't own. Nyera stepped forward, sea blade in hand, her expression calm as a cliff's edge. "We'll protect the heart," she said. "We've lost too many sisters already." Moira knew what she meant. The glowing chamber at the core of their refuge, the source of their strength, was not just sacred, it was alive. If it fell, so did the sisterhood. "We need to face them," Moira said, not with vengeance. With proof, she turned to Alric. "You saw this place. You were welcomed. Will they listen to you?" Alric looked down, uncertain. "Some might, but most. Fear has deeper roots than reason." Moira placed her hand on the compass still hanging around his neck. "Then we make them remember that we were always here, that we bled, we loved, we lost, that we deserve more than myth." That night the storm came, not of weather, but of men. Lanterns flickered on boats, voices shouted through horns, nets dragged like claws over the waves. Callum stood at the bow, eyes burning with hatred. "Witches!" he screamed. "Monsters of the sea!" But when they arrived, they did not find helpless women or trembling girls. They found a wall of light. The sisterhood rose from the depths in a formation as ancient as tide itself. Moira stood at their center, her pendant glowing like a heartbeat. "You left me to drown," she called across the waves, voice steady. "Now watch me rise." Behind her, Nyera lifted her blade. Around them, the sea began to shine with power. This would not be a slaughter. It would be a reckoning. The moment the sisterhood rose as one, the sea itself transformed. Waters that had once cowered before anchors now curled with defiance, lifting and falling with a rhythm older than human law. The boats carrying torches and hatred swayed wildly. Nets were torn from calloused hands. Moira floated just above the surface, her arms outstretched, not to summon vengeance, but to speak the truth they had tried to drown. "We are not curses," she shouted, her voice amplified by the very tide. "We are not beasts. We are what you feared, women who survived." Callum stood at the front, soaked and furious. but now less a man and more a memory, a warning carved into flesh. "She bewitched me," he roared, pointing. "She turned my own people against me." But the villagers on his boat, some of whom had prayed for Moira when she vanished, saw something different now. They saw the way the sea had embraced her, the way she did not attack, but protected. One woman dropped her torch. A man followed. The storm did not rise from the sky. It rose from their own doubt. Nyera glided to Moira's side, her sea blade still sheathed. "They will not all listen," she said, "but they will remember." And then Morwen rose from the heart of the current, her eyes glowing with the memory of centuries. "You have come to kill what you never understood," she said to the boats, her voice calm as death. "But we do not need your mercy. We never did." The waves around Callum's vessel lifted suddenly, holding him alone while the others drifted back. The compass at Alric's neck pulsed with a quiet warmth as he stared, helpless, at the man who had once called himself husband to a woman he threw away. Moira approached the boat's edge. "You feared a wife with a voice," she said to Callum. "Now you face a sea of them." She didn't curse him. She didn't touch him. She simply turned her back. And the water, with a mind of its own, pulled his boat backward into the fog, away from the cove, away from the sisterhood, away from memory. He would live, but no one would follow him again. The tides had spoken, and this time the waves belonged to the women. When the sea calmed and the last boat vanished into mist, the sisterhood did not cheer. They stood in silence, hearts heavy but whole, eyes watching the horizon where echoes of fear still drifted like foam. Moira sank slowly beneath the surface, her body no longer trembling, her spirit no longer chained. Nyera joined her, and for the first time since they met, her expression softened into something close to joy. "You led them," she whispered, "not with power, with truth." Moira smiled faintly. "I didn't know I could." Morwen gathered them once more in the chamber of stone and light, her fingers trailing the glowing veins in the walls. "We are no longer hidden," she said, her voice as ancient as the currents. "And so we must become more than legend. We must become story." She reached for a small shell bowl filled with water that shimmered like starlight. "Each of you," she said, "has lived without the name you were born to speak, without the title you were meant to carry. But now we reclaim them." One by one the women came forward, speaking names they hadn't dared say in years. Daughters of widows, midwives cast out, sisters blamed for storms. And finally, Moira stepped into the light. "I was Moira of Dunslow," she said, her voice steady, "but I am no longer of any man's house. I am Moira Tideborn, called by the sea and claimed by no one." The sisterhood murmured in approval, the name rippling through the water like a song remembered. Morwen nodded. "Then let it be known, Moira Tideborn stood when the land turned away, and from her the tide rose." That night they carved her name beside those long remembered, on a stone wall deep beneath the coral, where no barnacle would cling and no current would erode. Alric stood beside his mother, watching the ceremony with reverence. "You made a home from exile," he said to Moira as they drifted near the glowing ledge. "What happens now?" Moira turned to the open sea. "We teach others what they tried to forget, that women don't vanish. We transform." Behind them the salt sisterhood sang a melody older than language. And in that moment Moira knew the sea had never taken her life. It had given her one, not of silence, but of voice. Years later, children playing along the rocky shores of Dunslow would find tokens washed up after high tide, a pendant carved from sea glass, a woven braid of kelp, a pearl etched with symbols no one could read. Their mothers would hush them, casting nervous glances toward the sea. while the old women whispered stories they half believed. They'd speak of Moira, the fisherman's wife who disappeared and returned with eyes like stormlight, of the day the sea rose without wind and silenced a man no court dared question, of voices once drowned that now echoed through the waves. But deeper than memory, beneath layers of tide and time, Moira swam through corridors of light. Her hair flowed like silk in the current, her skin warm with power, her name carved into every current she passed. Tide-born, belonging not to man, not to land, but to herself. The sisterhood had grown, women from other coasts, drawn by the same ache, the same betrayal, found their way to the hidden heart. They arrived with bruises, with loss, with stories they were never allowed to finish. And Moira listened. She taught them not just how to swim through water, but through pain. She guided them through naming ceremonies, watched as new stone carvings joined the wall, and smiled when old songs were sung in new voices. Alric visited often, bringing tales from the surface, of men who now hesitated before raising hands, of villagers who left offerings near the tide pools. His mother, once a ghost of the sea, now swam freely beside him when he dove. There was peace, not because the world above had changed, but because the one below had chosen never to hide again. One evening, Moira swam to the rock where she had once been left to die. She sat upon it, hair damp with salt, looking out over the silver horizon. The sun dipped low, casting the waves in gold. She closed her eyes and whispered, not a prayer, but a promise. No woman shall be forgotten here. Behind her, the sea shimmered. The tide rolled in gentle and strong, and where once silence reigned, now the waves remembered. They remembered her. They always would.